Phepson Farm, organic farms, and we've got about 90 cows to the bull this summer. Going back to about 2003 when I came into the farm partnership at home, we've been through sort of a tricky patch, I guess, where through BSE and foot and mouth we didn't have those diseases, but market moves at those times, plus then family illness with Dad, meant that we ended up selling 130 acres, growing up on a 180 acre farm, and we're left with 50 at home on the home farm. And then from about 2003 onwards was working a job, doing conservation grazing for people, taking on tenancies, losing tenancies, back and forth, finding lots of different ways to not really make any money farming. And then about 6 or 7, which is good, that's like the light bulbs, and 1,000 ways to not make a light bulb before you made a light bulb. Edison, I think it was, wasn't it? So, that sort of set us up. And then I came across Alan Savory's book. In fact, I think it was John Meadley from Pasture Fed Livestock Association had given me Andre Vauzan's book on grass productivity, which I recommend to everyone for our climate. I think Alan Savory says that his book hasn't been bettered in terms of grazing management for our context. And in that was Alan Savory's foreword, and then I bought the holistic management book, and that summer started doing holistic grazing, holistic management, and then I think I went on a holistic management course that autumn, and then we changed everything on over. I could see the benefits, I could see suddenly an opportunity, and we took on a 180 acre tenancy with the National Trust. And then a few years later took on another 180 acres or 190 acres with a local landlord. She's committed to organic agriculture and extremely knowledgeable on a lot of the soil side of things and understanding that. And that's been great for us. But we wouldn't have had the confidence to move forward if we couldn't see a business model to expand that came from the holistic management framework. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, a little bit about what we do, and also talk about some of the process in terms of the species-rich grassland, which was what I was supposed to talk about, I think. Can I just ask how many people have been to an event here before? Okay, so there's only a couple, that's great, so I can just repeat myself. So I always start with this slide, because I think in terms of, there's lots of bad news about cattle at the moment. They're causing all these problems in the world, and all the climate change. It's got nothing to do with all the oil and coal and gas we're digging out from under the ground. It's all the cow's fault. I'm sure that narrative suits some people. But I think the trouble is that in many cases we can do a lot better. And if you look at the cattle system here, you've got a feedlot, and you've got the mountains behind. But this isn't a mountain, actually, that's a pile of cow manure. And that smoke, that was on fire for 2 years. And the trouble is, there's another feedlot. I think the point being that we can do better than this within the industry. But also the point to say that where a lot of the negative figures come about cattle and livestock, these are where the figures come from, these kinds of systems. And they're right to say that we can do better than that, I think. So that's our system. That's at Croom Court. You can see all the wildflowers there. And that's quite a good illustration of how we graze, because I'm about to move those cattle. They're coming down to me with a reel. But you can see how much we're leaving behind, almost as much as what we're going into. And I think I probably don't do things exactly as some people say you should with mob grazing, and but I think the key thing to remember is about rest periods, and there's whether you trample it or whether it's not trampled. I think we can sort of get into detail that can be unhelpful sometimes. But you can see we're leaving at least sort of half of the flower heads. Everything that gets grazed off here, even though I'm grazing it right in the middle of the flowering period, they all then flower and set seed about 3 or 4 weeks after the stuff that's left. So you still get the same volume of seed drop, and you still get all those wildflowers, and in fact you help them because you're taking some of the competitive grasses out, adding more light into the system as well. Grasslands, really important habitat worldwide. People often talk about our native primeval forests across on the planet, but we forget that grasslands make up, native natural grasslands and savannas make up such a huge proportion of habitat. And in fact, this is not worldwide as well, about 90% of all species worldwide are associated with the edge between the woodland edge between woodland and grassland, so kind of like a savanna habitat. And that was pretty much the dominant landscape across the planet for most of its history. And they were managed by herbivores. I'm not going to read the quote out, but you can see, I think that's a wonderful quote. And I think it's just to point out that in terms of tonnage of herbivores and stocking density compared to what we have now, we know that even with all the maize growing in America and the feed growing and all of that sort of stuff, we don't have the same number of large herbivores in North America that were there prehistory. And so we haven't actually bettered nature in terms of productivity, even with all our technology and how clever we are. I think the other thing to say is in terms of stocking density, the impact of these. So there's another quote I saw where one of the first settlers over there had written about how it took a herd of bison or buffalo 2 weeks to pass. It was that big. We're talking about a million strong herd. And just think about the animal impact and the impact on the soil, and when we could worry about a little bit of poaching here and there and all that sort of stuff. Think about what would happen with the recovery. And the other thing is, because they're nomadic and moving around, you've got the seed rate there as well. So you've got a huge amount of seed rate. So whilst you've got a lot of bare ground created, you've then got the recovery and rest period. So all the seed drop from the previous few years is there, and you've got so much competition for germination. You don't get the weed species coming in, and in natural native grassland situations, you don't have weed problems. Otherwise, our native natural grasslands prehistory would have been dominated by weeds, and the pollen records don't tell us that. Now, these animals were mobbed together, and they were nomadic, and they moved across continents through the seasons following the grass. And that created in itself the fact that they were concentrated together to get away from the predators, but also that because they were moving around in a kind of natural rotation, large-scale rotation, they were creating rest. So whilst they might graze everything off, then you have a rest and recovery period that allowed everything to come back and flourish. And that's kind of what we're trying to recreate. Essentially, like a lot of conservation work and my work in my life as a professional ecologist, we're trying to recreate natural processes, whether that's through our woodland management by canopy breaks and coppice rotations. It's the same thing with grassland management. We're trying to recreate natural processes, just like a hay meadow does in the same way. And that process of following the herds and that transhumance across landscapes, which still happens in some parts of the world today, but just got less and less as we put more and more fences up. But this was the usual way of managing livestock for a long time. And through this kind of management, I think this quote bears repeating again and again. There's just so much potential here. The reality is that if policy makers concentrated on this one issue in terms of how we manage our land, we solve this problem. It's as simple as that. We don't, as hard as it may be to hear, we don't need to necessarily concentrate as much on the fossil fuel side even. We solve this problem if we change our land management across a large enough area. And I think one of the quotes was that, an example, I think it was Christine Jones, the world-renowned soil scientist, said that in Australia, just across the continent of Australia, if they increase the soil organic matter or soil carbon by 1%, that would take out of the atmosphere the same amount of carbon that mankind has emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So you kind of see the potential of this is huge, and why we should be promoting it and doing everything we can.